Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei, coming to you live from Beijing on CGTN. Coming up on today's program, China calls for restraint amid the worsening battle over tariffs with the U.S. after Trump administration made the threat of a far broader 10% duty. Is there a way to pull from the brink of a likely all-out trade war? And in remembrance of World Refugee Day, I got up close with a former chief of the humanitarian group Doctors Without Borders, who tells us about sea efforts to save refugees bound for Europe and shares his own experiences in the most dangerous places on Earth. Let's begin our program today with threats of more U.S. tariffs. U.S. President Donald Trump threatened to impose a 10% tariff on $200 billion U.S. dollars worth of Chinese goods, worsening a tit-for-tat trade spat with China. The Chinese side has urged the Trump administration to stop damaging words and actions, and also criticizing recent tariffs as a flip-flop over signed trade deals. Besides China, the U.S. trade also drew flack from its northern and southern neighbors, including transatlantic allies, in a tiff over aluminum and steel tariffs earlier this month. Before our discussion, take a look at this.
Trade tensions between China and the U.S. are getting worse. The Ministry of Commerce said China would lose no time in carrying out a series of comprehensive retaliatory measures. The statement came after Mr. Trump threatened to levy a new 10% tariff on $200 billion U.S. dollars worth of Chinese goods on Monday. The White House last Friday announced a 25% tariff on $50 billion worth of Chinese goods. The Foreign Ministry again emphasized China doesn't want a trade war, but isn't afraid of one either.
I have to point out that the U.S. remarks confused the right with the wrong, and they made irresponsible accusations against China with the aim to cover up its own unilateral and protectionist moves. Recently, in disregard of our consensus, the U.S. demonstrated another flip-flop to ignite the trade war. It has lost its credibility to the people around the world and harmed the interests of the two peoples, the interests of the two countries, the enterprises of the two countries, as well as the interests of the people around the world. We don't want a trade war, yet we are not afraid of a trade war. We will continue to take effective methods to safeguard our interests, and we will also firmly uphold the economic globalization as well as the multilateral trading system.
China is not alone in taking on the U.S. over tariffs. Russia says it will impose duties on American goods in response to U.S. tariffs on metal. The U.S. in March introduced a 25% tariff on steel and a 10% tariff on aluminum imports from Russia. Moscow expects to lose a combined $3 billion U.S. dollars over the metal tariffs. At the beginning of June, the U.S. levied steel and aluminum tariffs on Canada, Mexico, and the European Union. Canada and EU countries are also set to retaliate with tariffs on a variety of American products, which will take effect next month. Mr. Trump's tariff policy does not sit well with all its trading partners, leaving the world's biggest economy the odd one out.
For more on the global impact on the worsening trade spat between China and the United States, let's turn to our panel. In Beijing, we have Yu Konghuang, a senior associate at the Carnegie Asia program. Welcome, sir, to our Beijing studio.
Pleasure to be here.
Good to have you this time. Also in Beijing, Liu Baocheng, who's the Dean of the Center for International Business Ethics from the University of International Business and Economics. Welcome, sir. Also joining us in Calgary, Canada, Carlo Day, the Director of the Center on Trade and Investment Policy at Canada West Foundation. Welcome as well. May I start with you, Mr. Huang? You brought a lot of information coming from Washington. But so help us to untie this mystery about what exactly the United States wants to achieve, given the fact that China, Canada, EU members have all decided to fight back?
Well, that's the mystery, of course, because depending on who you are and where you sit.
You're sitting here, I'm sitting here, so what do you say?
Coming from Washington, the same question is being asked. What is it they want? And the issue could be very simple. I want to lower the trade deficit. It could be, I want to change the terms that investment is flowing. But suppose it's something actually much broader. It's the great power relations, the systems which govern how trade and investment flows. Suppose Trump actually wants to change that system because it thinks that America has been disadvantaged under the previous rules, and now he wants to establish a different kind of regime to discuss these issues.
All right. It could be as immediate as the numbers. It could also be as so-called visionary as the overall global trade system. Mr. Liu, Professor Liu, what do you think about Dr. Huang's assessment?
Well, I pretty much agree, but the U.S. basic logic is that I'm taking unfair advantage of by the whole world, and now it is me, Donald Trump, he is there to get even because you know, my predecessors did a bad job, and now I'm going to correct it. But now he is really igniting a bomb that can really hurt the whole world, and including the United States, because the world are really retaliating against them, and this is really just one step. You know, there's going to be more blows ahead.
Well, really, the world, let's ask our Canadian guest. Mr. Dade, I mean, Canada has decided trade on steel and aluminum coming July. You're going to impose more tariffs on the U.S. goods as well, ranging from farm products to the others. But what about that? Is this only like a storm in the teacup when it comes to allied relations? At the end of the day, Canada, United States, no matter where the trade goes, it's going to come back to where it was. Is that going to happen?
Well, in the longer term, sure, but you know, as the famous joke about economists in the longer term, we're all dead. So there's going to be much damage done, I think, till we get back to post-Trump era, where we begin to rebuild the rules of international trade. I think what the Trump administration is trying to do, and living right next door to the Americans, we've been dealing with this for quite some time, but they're trying to renegotiate the terms of international trade on the one hand. On the other hand, the Americans really have talked themselves into a corner here. We've had generations in the U.S. saying NAFTA was the worst deal ever. The rules of trade are set against the United States. China is the enemy. China is trying to steal your job. And after generations of that, it's taken on a life of its own in the U.S. And you're seeing an administration that feels bound not at all by the international rules, that has no cognizance of the history of how we got here to the current world order, and is willing to follow the current mood to destroy it.
Well, Dr. Huang, your time to respond to that.
Well, I think part of the problem we have is the basic premise that America started this trade war with was that America had become disadvantaged by the system. The trade deficits are actually bad. So we economists, like myself, we basically actually say that trade deficits are neither good nor bad. It doesn't actually matter.
It's just a matter of fact.
Okay. And then the second assumption is a lot of these problems were caused by China in some way, because China has such large surpluses. And when you think about it, America's had a trade deficit for 40 straight years. How could it do this? And the answer actually lies in the fact that the dollar is a global currency. If the dollar is a global currency, it essentially automatically guarantees that America will have a trade deficit. This has nothing to do with Canada's policy, nothing to do with China or Europe. So the premise in some ways in which I would say America launched the trade wars on the assumption that deficits are being caused by others, the actual cause of it is because the dollar is a global currency, and this role of having the dollar as a global currency, economists call this the exorbitant privilege.
Well, as complicated as phrases that economists use, that's why the so-called constituencies would not even listen to dearly what you had to say, Dr. Huang. And therefore, this is a matter of fact that this administration wanted to do something. And they wanted to do something. Now China is the target. Now Canada is the target, and now EU countries, some of them are the targets. So what's going to happen as a result if they wanted to do something to what we're going to have in the future? I think that is the question.
But if your goal is to symbolize and show to the general public that you've addressed the issue with some punitive actions, the simplest thing to do is to levy a tariff, because it's very simple, understandable.
It's outdated, simple, and it is not the best way at all, but that is what is being done right now.
It serves the political, emotional needs of the administration.
So therefore, Professor Liu, is there, as a result of this, going to be domino effect? That after all, the biggest economy in the world, United States, can just levy heavy duty on the other countries, whether it's China, Canada, or some of the EU countries on steel and aluminum at least. So the other economies could act and do the same to the weaker economies of their own and say, well, we're just going to do this because we're stronger.
Well,
and what can you do? Bite the bullet?
I think each country is there to have their own domestic politics to answer. So they have to show to their own people that they are standing against that. So they have to show a certain attitude. But now between China and the United States, for example, in the two biggest economies, it's not only the attitudinal issue, but it's a real interest fight. And it seems that each one are loaded in a different way, though, with enough ammunition to fight back.
Yeah, we're going to talk about China and U.S. specifically, but for now, let's also talk about this multilateral trading system. As a result of what is going on right now, what might happen, whether it's WTO, whether it is our belief in multilateral trade, belief in coming to consensus through negotiation, will that ultimately change, Mr. Dade?
Well, the WTO is actually a system established largely by the Americans, obviously with help from the other leading economies over the past few decades. But it's been designed for American advantage, with American advantage in mind. A set of global trade rules that would allow trade to increase would naturally benefit the world's dominant, the hegemonic economy in the globe. That being the U.S. We tend to think of trade as a series of bilateral deals. Australia just signed a deal with China. Canada has a deal with Chile. We forget that at the basis of all of this, we have 170 some odd trade agreements around the world. That's the WTO. Canada does not only have an agreement with the U.S. and the Trans-Pacific Partnership countries, we have an agreement with 170 other countries around the globe through the WTO. So it's a fundamental basis that allows us to trade. The issue is we don't explain this to people, and this is the deeper issue. In Canada, we did not take the decades of NAFTA to explain the benefits, we being folks like myself and your guest, the governments, private sector that benefited. And there was this buildup of resentment and misinformation about the agreement. And we're seeing the same thing happen with China now and the WTO. So the real warning out of all this for us is for people like us to be able to communicate more effectively to more people the benefits of the global trade system.
Well, I guess it's time to warn, but probably it's already a little bit late to warn because that's already happening right now. The apparent changes coming from the United States. Therefore, Dr. Huang, this is my question. Does the U.S. know where it is driving itself together with the rest of the world and its trading partner too?
Well, it begins with the premise that the White House feels. One, it does not believe in multilateral solutions anymore. It believes in bilateral negotiations. It sees this as a transactional approach. So whether it's a WTO system or even a TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership, or bilateral NAFTA or trilateral relationships, U.S. feels as a great power, it can gain more by dealing with each country one-on-one.
Oh, wait. Dr. Huang, one verb you use is very interesting. You say U.S. feels. What is backing so-called feels?
What is backing that?
You don't have to explain about the administration's policy because really it's not your job. I put you in the corner. I'm
because
sorry,
Trump believes, as a negotiator in the past, he can do better by talking to a country one-on-one than going through what I call a rules-based system where many parties are at the table. And that is what he wants to test out. And he believes very strongly on this. So that's why he basically comes at Canada, then he comes at another set of countries, and now he's coming at China.
Let's take a look at this transactional kind of negotiation style. So what's going to happen the next day and the next few days? Extremely important. China already decided, Mr. Liu, without necessarily saying the time to implement it, to retaliate against the United States. Also on 50B, U.S. goods to China.
Yeah, equal scale, equal strength.
All right. And future, China is considering the same proportion, so-called quantitative and qualitative.
Right.
After saying that, you also see the EU has decided today, EU Commission, 2.8 billion onto U.S. goods, particularly steel and aluminum. And then you also see Canada likely to work on that beginning from early July as well, as earlier talked about by Canadian Prime Minister and later adopted by the Parliament as well. So you already see chain reactions started by the United States, and then U.S. trading partners, as a result of being quote-unquote punished by the U.S., react. How far are we going to see this chain reactions? And who are going to be the losers of this chain reaction? Are these only the countries that are reacting to the United States, or actually the scale could be much bigger? Professor Liu, your thought here.
Well, basic estimate, the world economic growth now still in a very fragile stage will be put back by at least 1%. So everyone will be the loser. I mean the whole world population.
All right.
That's number one. Number two, when you're talking about the chain effect, is that different countries who are being affected have different lengths of the chain. For example, people always say, okay, when we have a common enemy, we can easily form a coalition. But right now, for EU and Canada, they are on more specific issues than those, 301 issues,
we'll have our
etc.
Canadian guest to explain about his
That's
perspective.
Right. So
but what about for China, for example? China, you've been getting the components, let's just say, of your products, which eventually being exported to the United States, coming from different economies, let's just say South Korea, some of the Asian economies, developing countries, second-tier or developed economies. So is there going to be an impact on these economies if China really having a trade problem with the United States?
Definitely. For example, we import, the animal feeds from India, for example, the soybean expellers, and then we feed our animals, and then when we sell beef. And so, this whole thing, this whole global chain is being affected, and particularly in terms of the high-tech stuff. China buys all the pieces from all over the world, actually spare parts, etc. We are operating more as an assembly line for the whole world, and inclusive of the United States. So when we are obstructed with the end market, the United States, so we are not able to buy those small pieces from the rest of the world.
U.S. companies that export to China also seem to have some experience already with the recent trade dispute. Let's take a look at what is happening. Those U.S. companies that export to China took hits in their share values. Boeing down 3% if you look at the latest stock market. Caterpillar 2.7%. Apple 1.5%. Those are just the number of those multinational companies that are now originally from U.S. operating in China as its biggest market in the world. Mr. Dade, what about that? How far do you think the chain effect will be, the rippling effect will be, for example, for Canada?
So, this is where there is some hope in all of this. We need a way out of this escalating tit for tat. And the way out we may see in history. In 2002, President George Bush imposed tariffs on imported steel to the U.S. Again, he did it right before the U.S. midterm elections at the time. The tariffs were supposed to last for 3 to 5 years. The Americans cut the tariffs in 18 months. Not because the WTO ruled against the U.S., but because the tariffs were such an economic and political disaster in the U.S. Congress was prepared to move to take back trade authority from the president, but the administration itself chose to rescind the tariffs because the damage was so great. In 2002, those tariffs were not applied to Canadian and Mexican steel, which were two of the biggest suppliers to the U.S. Now they are. So the one hope we have is that the economic blowback we saw in the U.S. in 2002 returns this time, and again forces either the administration to change course or Congress. And we've already seen a move in Congress to try and take back the president's, take trade authority that Congress ceded to the president.
Well, we haven't seen much sign from the Congress, that's for sure, except of the immigration policy. Dr. Huang, before we go, trade war. The other country so-called being punished, fight back or not? What has history taught us?
Well, history's told us in trade wars that if you don't fight back, you will clearly lose.
Why would you say so?
Because you've given the other side the signal that they can do what they want to do, and they'll design the tariffs and the quotas in such a way to get all the benefits and leave you with very little. And that's what happened to Japan several decades ago. So you have no choice in a trade war except to retaliate. And the hope then is that when you retaliate, in fact, you're making the other side realize that you're going to stand up for what you think you're going to have to do so. And in the end, a compromise will be reached. So when the pain gets great enough, senses then start to emerge, then you're going to find what I call some kind of a solution coming out of all this.
All right. We hope the pain would not be that much because the world's going to suffer as a result. But we'll see how things evolve from here. Thank you so much for your insights, the three of you gentlemen, for being with us. Yu Kong Huang, Liu Baocheng, and Carlo Dade. Really appreciate it. Thank you for joining us. And you're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Still to come on our program. In remembrance of the World Refugee Day, I talked to someone who's been in the front line of saving those fleeing danger with no place to run. A former international president of Doctors Without Borders tells us about hope amid devastation.
The demands of the population.
Welcome back. You're still watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The program comes to you Monday to Friday on CGTN. Today is World Refugee Day. According to the UN, nearly 69 million people were forcibly displaced last year, and among them, about 25 million are refugees. Recently, the fate of a rescue ship of migrants has again roiled Europe. Italy and Malta refused to entry to the Aquarius rescue ship operated by the aid groups SOS Mediterranean Sea and Doctors Without Borders. The 106 migrants on board had to endure days of bickering before finally being taken in by Spain on Sunday. The incident reignited a continent-wide debate over how to handle immigration. The discussion will continue at the EU summit later this month as EU's 29 members are closer, if possible at all, to agreeing on a solution. One of the organizations that took part in operating the rescue ship is Doctors Without Borders. Earlier, I interviewed the former international president of this organization. Since 1995, he has been dedicated with unwavering passion and commitment to saving those in need in Afghanistan, Somalia, and everywhere in between. I met him in Beijing to recall his incredible journey. Although he is a tough nut to crack, the good doctor eventually opened up about the atrocities he has seen. How much difference can you guys make?
I think we all need to understand something. That, David Reef and others have talked about humanitarian action being emblematic of failure. The reason humanitarians are taking risks to provide health care and other assistance in very dangerous parts of the world because politics has failed. If we had communities that could live in peace side by side, or if we had governments that were responsive to the needs of people, or if we had a United Nations that really worked and were able to broker peace between warring factions and countries, then there would be very little need for humanitarian workers to take such, to provide assistance in large scale.
That makes it work very challenging, but at the same time, you have to be very skillful when you're in a crisis. You have to deal with all kinds of players. You have to make them understand that you guys are neutral. But in a crisis, particularly in a war, it's very hard.
The way humanitarian agencies get access to remote parts of the world, to places where there's this conflict going on, is by convincing various authorities. It could be the government, it could be whatever faction is in control of a particular area. You have to convince them that of your neutrality.
How would you convince?
Let's say Afghanistan. In 2004, we had 5 of our colleagues who were killed, and we decided to leave the country at that time because we felt the deaths didn't result in the kind of action that we expected from authorities. So in working in Afghanistan today, it's not just enough to convince the Afghan government, because we know that the Afghan government controls Kabul and a few other major cities, right? Big part of Afghanistan is still controlled by Taliban. So you have to, ultimately, in any of the places where we work, it has to be in their interest, or they have to see the benefit of allowing an organization like Médecins Sans Frontières into their region or into their area.
But how? The question is how?
Even rebel groups they have to get the population to side with them. And the way they do that is by providing them with services. Because they have some of the same compulsions that governments have. They are also subject to the demands of the population under their control. They also need health care, etc., right? So there is pressure not just on governments, but also on all sorts of other authorities for services to be provided. In my first mission in Ethiopia, for example, right, we were working in an area that was affected. This was in 1995. There was conflict between the Tigrayan people in the north and with the Somali people. We have, on occasions, have had to negotiate between these armed groups, especially in 95 and early 96, where we would get them to stop fighting for a day or two so that children in certain areas could be vaccinated. That is almost impossible today. The world has changed. There's been a proliferation of NGOs. It has also become a big humanitarian industrial complex, so to speak. $28 billion spent last year in humanitarian assistance. The number of NGOs that are in the field today have multiplied exponentially. They all have very different interests. I might talk about principles, but not all organizations are as principled as they should be. Many of them are not independent because they rely on governments for their funding. So all of that has actually changed the way that people in countries view NGOs. They're not always seen, at least today, as the impartial, independent NGOs that we think we are.
Do you have to make extra effort in order to convince people?
Yes, we have to. Part of the problem is also, so for example, I'll go back to Afghanistan again. We've had several situations where the government or the ISAF forces and Afghan government tried to imply that humanitarian agencies are a soft power to their hard power. That means that they're working together, they do the hard work and we do the soft work. And we are not, because the ISAF is a party to war. So if you are taking your cues and your orders and getting your funding from the government and from, let's say, the US government, then you've already chosen your sides. You're no longer neutral, right? So these sort of narratives actually lead the population to believe that you're not neutral, and also what that also does is you then become a target of war. You then become legitimate targets,
right? Because
you're no longer neutral.
At least not perceived.
Not perceived to be neutral. And this is also what happened in Iraq at some point. And I remember in 2013, these were the days before the big massive violence, a lot of people killing and being killed in bomb blasts, etc. I traveled by road from Basra to Baghdad, about 900 kilometers I think, and it was fine. But as I reached Baghdad, there were US convoy tankers that were bombed, and that were blasted by an RPG. I personally felt safe because I'm an Indian. Indians had no stake in Iraq. But 1 week later, just 1 week later, on the same road, an ICRC vehicle was stopped.
Yeah.
ICRC worker was pulled out of the car and killed, and he was Sri Lankan. He probably looked just like me, and the driver's hands were cut off. And then you realize that false sense of security that you had. And a few weeks later, the UN office was bombed in Baghdad. And Sergio Vieira de Mello, who was the head of the office, we shared the same birthday, and I knew him from the year that I had worked in Azerbaijan. So these are the moments when you really doubt yourself and the work that you do, because suddenly all of the risk and the danger and everything comes very close to home. And it makes it very for me it was very difficult to go back to Iraq for a while after that, even though I personally didn't face any danger, but that
what
false,
happened later,
yeah, that false sense of security you had was somehow, that bubble had burst, and it became very difficult for me to go back to Iraq for a while after that.
Is your mom and your beloved ones also convinced about your cause?
They were always worried. Every time I get into a plane to go to Colombia, I used to go to Colombia a lot, and there was at that time the risk of kidnapping was very high, and I would make a mental note. Well, if I'm kidnapped for 6 months, I learn Spanish. If I'm kidnapped for a year, I would, do something else. So I would make these mental notes, because you have to approach, because there is a risk involved in everything you do. But I'm also comforted by the fact that as an organization, we take these risks very seriously, and we really make attempts to mitigate the risk as much as possible.
So under the current circumstances, Unni, how do your organizations protect yourself?
In all of the places where we work at the moment, we do not have armed guards. And I go back to what I mean. It's a constant conversation with different authorities and stakeholders in the country.
It must be frustrating. I mean, you always have to tell people, we are neutral. We are neutral, and we are neutral. We are here for your benefits. Even though you are practicing it all the time, people are still not trusting you.
But that is what we do. That is what keeps us safe. And I can say...
What do you mean by that?
That sitting every day, drinking endless cups of coffees and tea with the people, and then trying to tell them, and you're being quizzed about your finances. Where does your money come from? Who supports you? All of these, they really get into details, and they ask you all of this before they make a decision whether they should allow you in or not. And the truth is, today, in some of the most difficult parts of the world, in Syria, in Somalia, in the Maghreb, in many of these places, it is actually not that easy to provide humanitarian assistance. It's actually dangerous. So then you have to make the decision on what amount of risk you should take.
Unni, you've been working in Somalia for quite some time.
Yes.
You leave the people there.
Like I said, my first mission was with the Somali people in eastern Ethiopia.
So when you announced that, what was it like for you?
It was a very emotional moment. One of the saddest moments of my 20 years with MSF was in August 2013, when I had to announce that we were pulling out of Somalia. Because if any population in this world requires humanitarian assistance today, that's Somalis.
Yeah.
Right? There was a dire need for assistance. We knew that when we left Somalia, there would be large parts of the country with no access to health care. We knew people would die because there was no health care. But we had also reached a point where it was getting very difficult to keep our teams safe.
Do you still remember some of the Somalians you met?
Yes, and in fact, the Somali staff that worked for Médecins Sans Frontières, they were very upset, and I think rightly so. They trust and believe in an organization like Médecins Sans Frontières to meet the needs of people in Somalia, but even they left, you know, and that was a big letdown, and I feel that as well.
For your work, these kind of debts just keep on piling up, the emotional debts. What is it like for you, for someone who's working in that organization, who are leading the team?
It is only natural, I think, that if you spend a lot of time doing this kind of work, you become very cynical, you start questioning the utility of the work at all, because we've been working in South Sudan for 30 years, and the outlook for South Sudan today is no better than perhaps what it was 30 years ago, right? But at the same time, the opposite. Do we not do anything? Do we let these people die? Do we not stand in solidarity with these people when they're going through the most difficult time? What makes me do this work, or continue to do this work, is the strong belief that we are standing with people when waiting for politicians and others to find solutions to the problem.
But you're also providing, some would argue, the opportunity for the politicians, for example, not to seek a solution because situations are not getting as worse as they could.
No, I would really object to that characterization. I think it's like, you know, you have a daughter and she falls ill, and you take her to the emergency room, and then 1 year later she falls ill, and then you take her to the emergency room. Well, I mean, one could say, what's the point in patching her up, because every year she's coming to the emergency room. That is not the way.
It's not the logic.
That's not the logic. We are standing with people, or standing in solidarity with people when they're going through the worst periods in their lives. Meanwhile, we have a world order, we have the United Nations. Their job is to find solutions. And unfortunately, the UN today is more of a debating chamber than a place where decisions are made and enforced.
When you are in frustrated situations, how do you convince yourself, once again, about your cause? How do you get out of those personal psychological disasters?
So very often the reality sinks in after you leave. On the ground, you are very busy. You're working. Your work starts in the morning and it ends when you hit your bed. But what keeps me alive is those individuals, the boy that survived malnutrition, the men we treated from sleeping sickness in Congo-Brazzaville. These individual faces then stick in my mind, and that's what helps you get over. It's never really Somalis or the context, it's those faces that you see that makes you want to go on. 20
years after that, you are taking a temporary break, it seems. But now, if you reflect back upon your professional career with Médecins Sans Frontières, what are some of the major points you think we can share?
I never saw this as a career. I wanted to do it for a year, but then I went back for another year, and then before I knew it, it was 20 years, and now it's 22 years. So I never saw it as a career. It was more like a vocation, something that I was compelled to do, right?
The passion there.
A passion, or the feeling that you cannot sit by when all of this is going on. You cannot sit by and not do anything, right? And very often I have to admit that we don't always know whether we're doing the right thing. We know the right thing medically. We know if you give this vaccination, then you prevent this disease. We know if you treat a person for malaria, that person will survive. But the overall assistance, providing, there have been instances where journalists have written about perhaps aid work prolongs. So these are considerations, but these are all the luxury. With the hindsight, you can make these determinations whether aid was successful or not. But at that moment, when people are suffering, I am proud, or I am glad that we have doctors and nurses who are willing to act.
And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Insight CGTN into your search engine or check out our YouTube channel. You can also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching, and tune in again next time for insights across China and around the world. Good night.